Everyone, can everyone hear me? Okay. So welcome back. We are now at group 2, second panel for our graduate discussion. My name is Darlene Bautista and I'll be the moderator. I will now pass it on to Professor Cassandra Lord at the University of Toronto, Mississauga.
Hi everyone, I'm happy to be here today and to moderate this panel. And thanks to the WGSI GSU for creating this event and space. I'm really thrilled about these two papers that we're going to hear from today, these two panelists. So the first paper is from Emily Yraceburu, who is from Claremont Graduate University. And Emily, let me know if I pronounced your last name correctly. And Emily's paper is called Dancing with Guns, Military History and Queer Identity in a Performance Art Community. And Emily's also graduated in May 2020 during this pandemic with an MA in Cultural Studies from Claremont Graduate University. And Emily is primarily interested in subculture and queer formations as sites of resistance. The next panelist that we have is Fatemeh Gharibi, and Fatemeh is from York University. Fatemeh uses the pronouns she, her, and they. And Fatemeh is a PhD student in gender, feminist, and women's studies at York. She's interested, as her bio says, uses the pronoun he and she, is interested in queer feminist theater and performance studies as they intersect with gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and nationality. And Fatemeh's paper is called Queer Theorizing Through Theater Performance with the Iranian Closet. So two wonderful papers that are very rich in terms of their abstract and dealing with performance that I'm excited to hear today. So each paper will have about 15 panelists will have about 15 minutes to present their papers, and then we'll do a Q&A. So I'm just going to hand it over first to Emily.
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction. My last name is pronounced Yraceburu. The Y is silent, so it's a little weird. But thank you so much for everyone who put on this panel, and I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to speak today. It's a hot summer day. A football field in a small town is full of 150 young performers. Most of them are musicians, a marching band. Surrounding the band are 40 performers, dancing and brandishing colorful flags and an object that is reminiscent of a rifle, but could never be mistaken for a working firearm. These performers were the most animated of the marching band, and also the last to be considered by the general population when they think of marching bands. These members form the color guard on tour for the drum corps season. In the winter months, they will perform in gyms apart from the musicians, and their visibility in the public eye will be further reduced. Most people only see the tip of their iceberg. Greater depths of that iceberg will show a thriving queer community and an international competitive art form. While this may be intriguing in and of itself, what is perhaps most compelling about this community is that while it appears to be a dance-based theatrical performance community, it was formed out of the US military. Color guard and drum corps were created following World War I in order to instill military values in youth by veterans who just returned from what they believed to be the war to end all wars. It's difficult to imagine how a community that formed to indoctrinate youth into US patriotism morphed into a queer performance community, and yet color guard seems to exist within this paradox. My project served as an exploration into how the color guard community's queer present collides with its military past and the impacts of that military past on its queer present. Ultimately, I intended to demonstrate that queering the legacy of military culture in the color guard community has allowed it to become a site of queer exploration and community formation, while simultaneously the remnants of military culture have created a dangerous atmosphere where sexual assault can occur with few repercussions. For this study, I used both ethnographic and autoethnographic methods, relying on interviews from queer individuals from a broad spectrum of identities and observations interwoven with my own experiences of being a part of this community for over a decade. My participants described how the color guard community served as a site where they could be in the process of what Shoshana Rosenberg calls coming in, which focuses on the internal journey of self-discovery rather than assuming disclosure as the pinnacle and completion of queer identity exploration. Notably, few members of this community consider color guard's military past to be relevant to its present. One of my participants, with a hint of annoyance, said, "I'm truly disgusted by the military, and the thought that my favorite art form has evolved from that makes me upset. And that's the extent of my relationship with that." For many, the military history of the color guard community seems a distant memory because the art form is no longer aesthetically similar to militaristic groups. While equipment such as rifles, sabers, and flags are still used in conjunction with drill formations, the addition of dance and theater often lulls members into believing that the military history now exists as little more than a quirk of the past. However, the remnants of the military past run much deeper than aesthetics into the culture of the community. Although a queer performance community formed from military values seems paradoxical, its possibility is rooted in experiences of queer individuals within the US military. LGBTQ+ individuals have always existed in the military, but for many, their stories have been about resiliency, existing despite military structures. In the US, queer individuals have been restricted from military participation in both formal structures, such as Don't Ask, Don't Tell and Trump's transgender military ban, and informal homophobic attitudes. However, some research has argued that military structuring allows and even encourages exploration of queer identities. Aaron Belkin, in his review of homophobic military attitudes, suggests that there are 6 aspects of military structuring that, perhaps unintentionally, encourage this exploration. These are buddy systems, dislocation, tolerance, psychiatric screening, prohibition, and hierarchical social positioning. Color guard has queered these aspects to encompass not only the repressed or discrete exploration of queer identity, but the sustaining of an out community. I will primarily address buddy systems, dislocation, and hierarchical social positioning. In regards to buddy systems, Belkin claims that historically the military has encouraged intense same-sex friendships that have allowed for the exploration of same-sex intimacy and desire. He points out that during World War II, men often shared beds when traveling, and that physical intimacy sometimes led to a desire for even greater intimacy. These men were also encouraged to share an emotional intimacy as they spent so much of their time together. One of the most easily recognized correlations within color guard is the system of seat partners. In traveling between housing sites during drum corps, members travel via charter buses, often spending the majority of their nights sleeping on the bus, sharing their seat with a seat partner. Beyond the inherent physical intimacy of this space, seat partners often emotionally support each other throughout the summer. The intimacy created by this friendship can easily become a site for exploration, as evidenced by this story from one of my participants. Quote, "In 2017, my seat partner had a boyfriend, but her and I would make out all the time. And her boyfriend was fine with it. He marched a different drum corps, but her and I would make out all the time. And she identifies as straight, I'm pretty sure. So I feel like things in drum corps happen. Like my seat partner, she was like, 'Can I kiss you? Do you want to get married on the free day?' And I was like, yeah, dumb stuff like that." This perfectly encapsulates how the physical and emotional intimacy created by these bonds allows for safe exploration of sexuality in a way that would not feel possible in most settings. The next component of military organization that contributes to queer exploration is dislocation. In joining the military, service members were uprooted from social constraints that encouraged heterosexuality, such as churches, families, and small towns. In color guard, regardless of the season, there is a removal from many social constraints. Members may be removed from their lives for weeks or even months at a time. In no manner is the effect of dislocation more obvious than in the language members use to discuss their lives. For example, it is common in rehearsal to hear members discuss what they do in real life. Real life is a phrase used to describe life on the outside that does not touch color guard. Members talk about their real life friends or their real life jobs. That is not to say that those friends or jobs are more real as in genuine, but seem to imply real as in a degree of normalcy. If life outside of color guard is real life, then what is life inside of it? It implies that the consequences of certain actions may have less bearing. It creates a sort of fantasy world outside the constraints and social norms that queer individuals are often subjected to. Belkin also suggests that hierarchical social positioning within the military also allows for the exploration of queer identities. He claims that the rigid social positioning of superiors and subordinates may inspire them to fall in love with each other. Officers may feel protective and loving of their subordinates, and subordinates may eroticize officers out of hero worship. As fantasies, these relationships can provide introspection into one's own desires. However, the relationship becomes far more complex when it begins to manifest physically. Power imbalances can complicate issues of consent, though consent is not necessarily absent. The dangers of power imbalances and consent is demonstrated in the widespread sexual assault that occurs within the military, both with opposite and same-sex relationships. However, within the color guard community, it is also not uncommon for members and staff to form intimate relationships from close friends to marriage, in many ways queering the power structures that hold members and staff as separate. These bonds can bolster color guard members' abilities to explore their queer identity, yet it simultaneously can produce imbalances that may result in harassment or assault. Sexual assault has been a continuous problem facing the color guard community and has become impossible to ignore after a series of news articles were published in 2018 exposing the history of assault by many prominent community members. Currently, the color guard community is unable to perform due to the COVID-19 pandemic. While the loss of the opportunity for connection is greatly felt, it seems as though the community is using this time to confront some of its more sinister aspects of its culture, primarily sexual assault. During this time, several more prominent members have been called out, and performers have taken it upon themselves to fold organizations with problematic directors. At present, the primary topic of discussion, apart from how to stay safe, seems to be how to address this history of assault and make structural changes to put an end to the violence within our community. As a member of this community, I believe that we are resilient and able to move and able to evolve far past our origins. I hope that in looking back upon our history, we are better able to address the problems of our present. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Fatemeh, would you like to begin?
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you for making it possible. Let's make the screen, do the screen share. Okay. Well, my work centers around analyzing an Iranian theater performance and its production. I will start with introduction and context, and then I will talk about theoretical frameworks and finally the analysis of the play. In Iran, the state's heteropatriarchal sexual regulation uses censorship to homogenize and discipline sexuality based on their interpretation of Islamic Sharia. As a result, there has been a deep split between the public and the private, especially since the 1979 revolution, forcing non-conforming sexual expression underground. The theater stage is a site of extreme surveillance of public space of Iran. Artists have to go through multiple stages of verification to receive the performance permission. Surprisingly, an Iranian play called As, translating to the verb is, directed by Pania Shams, in which one of the central themes is same-sex relationship between two adolescent girls, has been staged since early 2019, and this makes a unique and worthy of a close study. I asked the following questions. How is it possible to create queer theater without coming out in contemporary Iran? What are some of the strategies utilized by the Iranian theater company to exist and resist heteropatriarchal sexual censorship in Iran? I argue that sexual censorship in Iran has produced new formations of sexuality within the underground scene. I explore how queer Iranians use a conforming narrative of self in conduct, as Afsaneh Najmawadi says, to manage their closetedness in the hostile public spaces and produce theater with queer content. I also explore how this identification may be a strategy that marked a difference with the dominant heteropatriarchal ideology. I posit that AST is a mediation capable of reflecting the reality of girls performing non-heteronormative sexualities at this particular time in Iran. That reality is being unspeakable and ambiguous. I employ a queer feminist framework to understand the queer layers in display and the strategies used by the theater company. Through a minimalist form, intended ambiguities and silences as creates a space for the audience to use their imagination and shared memory to fill the blanks produced by the censorship. Therefore, I read Ast from the location of a spectator who is an Iranian woman still in the closet, who experienced the same gender-segregated repressive school system, and as a theater artist who worked under the sexualized censorship. I searched for the sexuality-related moments of silence and equivocation in the play. In Epistemology of the Closet, Yves Sedgwick theorizes the closet as a space of discursive relations between, quote, the known and the unknown, the explicit and the inexplicit around homoheterosexual definition. Sedgwick defines closetedness as, quote, performance initiated as such by the speech act of a silence. She explains how the closet becomes at once revealing through discursive silences that are shaped in relation to the ignorance. To understand how ASK disidentifies with dominant heteropatriarchal ideology, I searched for the performances of the transgression and how they reflect discourse. Jose Esteban Munoz defines this identification as an attempt to transform oppressive institutional instructions from within, while it is mindful of the situated experience of the minoritarian subject. As Munoz puts it, resistance may use the same dominant discourses to create its truths and transform the dominant ideology from within. I use qualitative textual analysis through a discursive reading. However, since my text is a performance in addition to spoken words, as mentioned, I analyze performances, embodiments, and other theatrical elements as well. This is a queering practice relying on speculation rather than evidence. Thus, it results in blurry understandings. As deploys a minimal realistic plot, Mahur has just come to her new school. The Nagar-Mahur bond starts with a passionate friendship and leads to a rebellious force. They seem what I call friends in excess. Heteropatriarchal ideology of the school sees this excess as an inappropriate act, therefore a regulatory script, as Najma Abadi puts it. They try to either normalize it by forcing the girls to sign a written confession and promise to end the relationship, or remove those subjects by expelling them from the school. I see a possibility of queerness in this seemingly excess, by queer in its widest and the most inclusive meanings. Strategies of survival of the theater company include closetedness through a narrativizing self in conduct and using the polyvalence of discourse, as Foucault says, and relational power of ambiguity in language. Shams, the director, promoted a conforming and conservative interpretation of ASK through the press, what she calls the story of a misunderstanding. This story presumes girls as heterosexual. Using Najma Abadi's theory of professing selves, I argue that by emphasizing that narrative, they were able to survive censorship and pass as a conventional play. Najma Abadi defines sexual minorities' experiences in Iran as living livable and loving lives within the terms of ambiguity and contingent performances of selves in situational conduct, in quotes. This is a notion of self that is separated from the identity, a self, quote, self-narrativized through horizontal situational conduct rather than through deep vertical self-referentiality. Similarly, in the play, the girls try to maintain the discourses of the good girl in Iran, which is sexless, obedient girl and always already victim. However, they disidentify with these discourses by various performances. Using relational power of ambiguity in language. Censors in Iran use ambiguity in criteria as a technique to have unlimited authority. On the other hand, artists also use ambiguity as a technique to survive censorship because they would be able to negotiate the interpretations of their work. In ASK, in addition to a minimal form, the theater company uses the concealing and ambiguous character of Persian language and literature. Since Persian is a gender-neutral language, always there is room for sexual and gender ambiguity. For instance, the beloved in Persian literary text can be either the opposite sex or the same sex. So for example, in Hafez poetry, the word yar can be interpreted as a beloved, a friend, a companion, a mentor, or even the king. However, as students, we always knew that we are expected to interpret, for instance, the beloved as God, and sharab, wine, which is prohibited in Islam, as a metaphor for the divine love for God. In the beginning scene in the Persian literature class, Mahur interpreted Bidel, literally heartless, as someone who has never been in love. The class mocks her and the audience laughs out loud because they know she is not supposed to interpret it as an earthy love. The official interpretation for Bidel in a school is an unbeliever person. We get the plot of our closeted story from this first scene. This is a love story. In that last verse of the poem they are reading, we hear Yar, the beloved, will be killed because of revealing the secrets, which can refer to Negar getting expelled from the school at the end of the play. These identificatory performances. Mahur and Negar rebel and express their sexuality by a few minimal but powerful performances. Mahur wears red lipstick standing on the desk, showing off for the invisible surveillance cameras. I see the climax of this closeted love story when Negar and Mahur are exchanging their scarves. They giggle and perhaps kiss under their hijab, what is supposed to prevent them from illegitimate sexual encounters. They use the performance of veiling against the veil. Veil, similar to compulsory gender segregation, creates a private homosocial space, a closet on the stage. In the last scene, back in the classroom, Negar is absent because she refused to sign the written confession and she got expelled while Mahur did not. Mahur finds a wrapped gift, her old overcoat that she had gifted to Negar. Then she responds to Negar's call to unlearn the normalization of the school. She takes off the school uniform, wears her own overcoat, and leaves the school. This is a performance of this identification when the sexless and obedient girl using the same elements that I believe represent heteropatriarchal sexual censorship. Munoz sees such individual manifestations of resistance, not only as political resistance, but also as a way of theorizing. The effect of such theories might be different for each spectator. When I was there and the show was over, the first thing I thought was, yes, I watched a queer love story in Iran, and that was wonderful. Yeah, thank you, that's all.
So there are two fantastic papers that we are hearing from today, and I'm just going to open up the screen to discussion. So if anyone has any questions, please, Darlene will take the questions on the chat, and I will take any hands or any other methods that people are using to enter into this discussion of these two great papers. I wanted so much more of the papers. They're so rich, and I'm like, oh, it's the end. So I'm thrilled to hear what's going to come up in our discussion. Questions, comments? Yes, Louise.
Hello, this question is for Dr. Gharibi. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I'm really intrigued by the idea of this play getting past the censors as a passing in a way, and I'm wondering if you might say more about kind of, I don't know, what areas of meaning open up for us when we think about works of art as passing or in and out of the closet themselves.
First of all, I'm just a first-year PhD student. I'm a doctor, but thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and the idea of this paper came to me because when I moved here to Canada last year, all I was here as was this universal narrative of out and proud LGBTQ communities. And I was thinking of people like me who are still living a closeted life, even for not wearing hijab. My family doesn't know about it. So I was thinking of these lives that are always excluded from our work, and especially like theater work. But the irony of theater is that is like the most public place is actually like literally the stage, and everybody's looking at it. And I was thinking, how can I, because I also work in applied theater, I was working, how can I produce a theater that is actually respects the closeted lives but tells their stories. And then I was informed about this play. That was wonderful. And I understand that they are working on this shared understanding of the audience because of shared cultural values, because of, for example, these interpretations of Persian poetry. The audience was laughing because we all had this experience at this school, that we knew that what we are supposed to say. So I think that's a thing that we can all think of, the idea of shared experience with the audience and how we can, I'm not actually like praising and glamorizing, as Cedric says, glamorizing the closet. I'm not glamorizing the closet. I know the pain of the closet, but sometimes coming out is dangerous, especially in the countries like Iran. It's like you can lose your life, not always, but you can. But so I think really we should start thinking about these other lives. And for me, like the moment was when I was sitting there and I said, okay, I'm understanding things that they are not showing. And that's because of that shared experience.
Thank you, Fatemeh. Any other questions? I have some questions. I have a question for Emily around your paper today. And it's interesting how the three areas that you focus on are more about how the performances of the everyday within the context of the group. And I want you to talk a little bit about, I guess, those, how did you, how are you thinking about, I guess, the larger frame of performance as a framework within those everyday practices and within the everyday, and when I say the everyday, what I'm actually referring to here is more about the intimate spaces that are created that the members of the group come into contact with each other. For example, you said one about the buddy seat system. So I don't know if you want to expand a little bit about that, or how you're thinking about the framing of performance within that context, or to speak about that.
Yeah, you know, this is like one of those things that I really had to narrow down, that there was so much that I wanted to talk about that I just don't always have time for. But there's so, like, this space is very, very intimate. So for example, another part that I hadn't put in is that a lot of times as these members, specifically in drum corps, travel the country, they end up showering in high school gyms, which are very like open shower spaces, and how that also plays into a certain kind of expression of gender and expression of sexuality. And again, one of the other things that I wasn't totally able to address is that for some reason that I have not yet been able to discern, the like marching band, the musicians tend to be a little less of a queer space, even though they occupy a lot of the same location. And so what gets really interesting in particular about that showering space, from what I've heard with the male showers in particular, is the way in which like the straight cisgender males will perform a certain over-the-top masculinity in order to separate themselves away from this queer community. And then at the same time in which the way that a lot of the like the queer men that share that space with them, like in the ways in which that they perform to find like a separation and their own like location. And it's really, you know, it's really interesting because then on the flip side, like where with the male showers is this very strong divide between like sexuality and identity. When you move into like the more female showers, which, and still they generally exist within a binary, but when you move into that space, the women are so much more free and open, again, allowing for exploration. You know, helping each other shower, washing each other's hair, just this very like lovely communal experience that also then kind of takes down a lot of those barriers that we have in most of our lives. And so I just think that that's like really interesting that in these very intimate spaces, it kind of changes how we perform our sexuality and our gender. I think you're still muted.
I'm so sorry. There's trucks going by and I didn't want to infringe on the conversation. Just a minute, I want to check the chat because I think there may be a question for Fatemeh, and then we could probably, we can bridge back both of those papers. So thank you, Emily. And the question is for Fatemeh, how do you think having different interpretations of the same words provide room for queer plays in Iran? So the performative language of terminologies that are used.
Thank you for this good question. I should say it's not only the different interpretations of the same word, is how we actually direct the audience towards different interpretations. So in a case of, like, as I said, it's as Foucault says, is like the relationality of power and how both sides and different sides they use it. In a school, they promote a specific interpretation of the words, for example, in the poetry, for the students to regulate their sexualities, to desexualize them, actually. But the interesting thing for me in the play was how the director was actually leading us towards the other meanings, how the students, by making a mistake in interpreting the poem, actually led us to understand that, no, they are talking about the actual earthy love between human beings. So I think beyond the different interpretations, it's important how we, every one of us, direct people towards the meaning that we are intended to say. I hope I answered your question.
Is there any more questions for these two wonderful panelists who have really rich papers? So one of the questions I had to bring these two papers together is one about, so how might, and I used the word resistance in kind of a broader term, but I find that in both of your papers, there's a way in which the papers kind of try to circumvent the idea of like this kind of coming out or the closet, those kind of binaries. And I want you to, if you could both speak in different ways to some examples in your work. And I think, and Fatemeh, you've provided us some examples, but if you want to talk a little bit more about that. And Emily, you've had some rich vignettes that you provide, and you've had some good examples of how resistance and kind of moving or pushing past kind of the closet operates within the context of the military, which has the larger thing that you're talking about is the sexual assault that happens. So either of you can begin, or if you answer this question.
Well, Emily, go ahead, if you like.
All right. Yeah, I think that in regards to resistance, like there's so many ways in which this idea of like a closet or, you know, being out or in is like, those barriers are kind of broken down. There's another little narrative that I wasn't able to put in about this notion of what people call a tour bay, which is basically when you're on tour and you're performing, it's your significant other for the summer. And one of my participants who is queer and out and all that, he was telling me about another performer that he'd been with who, like, they were tour bays. And tour bays is a very casual term. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. And this person in their real life identified as straight, heterosexual, cisgender, all these things, but under the context of having another same-sex tour bay, he was able to kind of push past that and explore that aspect of his sexuality in a context that didn't feel so serious as it might have felt doing it out in the real world. And just one of the things that I found working throughout this paper is that in, I don't want to say all queer spaces, but in what is expected of queer people from a larger society is that you have to, like, is for a full disclosure. You know, people want a list of your gender and your sexuality, and it's not always that clear cut. Some of my participants identified as, you know, when asked about their gender identity, one of them identified as bullied into being a woman. She didn't identify as a woman, but she specifically identified as bullied into being a woman. Or I had another participant who kind of struggled when I asked her how she felt comfortable defining her sexuality. She immediately started to define it in a way that she felt would make other people comfortable. And I was like, no, what language do you use? Or do you use language at all? Like, it's all, so I think within the context of this space, there's so much that allows for individuals to not really have to explain themselves, not really have to have those labels, and to be able to just move through life and to be able to figure things out how they want to, rather than to have to explain and give language to every single aspect of their identity.
It's wonderful. Fatemeh?
Yeah, Emily actually said a lot of my points, but I want to add that in terms of, I mean, I think the problem with us in the less represented countries when it comes to LGBTQ communities is just kind of the Western hegemony on the idea of LGBTQ communities, and it's the way that it's like the only valid lives are the lives that they are living, which is full of like out and proud resistance. But I want to draw your attention to a lot of way of livings that they are going on in Iran. And as I said, for example, gender segregation, which is, I don't approve that, but that's provided a homosocial kind of living, and in the dormitories, in the, I don't know, in different places, that for women to bond in different ways and to express their sexualities and experience. And it's not something new. In Iranian history, we had like the vows of sisterhood. That's exactly a replica for lesbianism in history. So we had that histories, and we are living those lives, but we don't have, as Emily said, a specific category or name for that. That was my problem when I first come here. Everybody was asking about my sexual life, which is for me is still something private. I didn't have like a label to explain the way I'm living. So yeah, I think that's mostly, and also the notion of identity is also important if we think of it, and if we try to distance from it sometimes, because as I said, Najmabadi says, in Iran, it's kind of common sense for you to have different narrative of yourself. You don't carry around your sexual life. When you are the daughter of your father, you're just the daughter of your father. You're not a lesbian. You know what I mean? It's just, there are different forms of identities that we should think about it. I hope I had a good answer.
So we have a minute, and I want to bring those 2 points together, because Emily, as you were speaking, it's almost like you're showing us in your work how people's practices, their everyday practices, tell us a different kind of story about how to be, what can be named and what cannot be named, right? So the slippery slope between those. And Fatemeh, what you were also talking about, the segregation, it's almost like the state's enforced segregation is allowing different spaces to emerge that's actually using the dominant ways of understanding to recraft and retool how communities or people and relationships are formed. And so I think there's the two lovely ways, generative ways of understanding you know, these different geographical spaces and how they come to be. I think it's a really two rich areas. And Darlene, I think we're almost at time. And so if there's one more question, maybe we can take, if possible, if there's in the chat. No, so I guess I'm just going to close this session by thanking all of you and thanking our two panelists, Fatemeh and Emily, for offering such a, I mean, it's really helping me think through my own work today. So I'm just going to go back and think through some ideas. But thank you so much for your generative papers and also for participating in this online and everyone else. So I wish you both a really good afternoon and everyone else in the group. And Darlene, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Lord, for chairing our panel today. So we're going to take a quick 5-minute break and then we will start again. So at 2:55, we will start the third panel on affect.